History is not only about events, it is also about culture. It's hard to generalize about an entire continent, but as I've seen for myself on my travels in this series, there are fundamental similarities in how Africans south of the Sahara live. In this episode, we see how they ordered their societies, worshipped, dispensed justice, treated the sick, and related their own history. But we also see how the arrival of the Europeans brought change and challenges.
I think the state of the African continent and the people's way of life at that time exposed them to exploitation by the colonialists.
They looked at everything that was African as heathen and therefore needing cleansing.
Crowds enjoy a street performance in the Ugandan capital, Kampala. That's if you're not too small to miss out. When we talk about African culture today, it is essentially a mixture of influences throughout the centuries, because of course Africans traded and exchanged ideas as well as goods with many outsiders. But what can be described as indigenous African traditions, customs, and practices? Well, Africans lived either in communities led by chiefs, or they were the subjects of a kingdom. Agriculture was, and still is, their main activity. Farmers produced what they ate and sold or exchanged the surplus. Sometimes they had to work for their chiefs. I visit a settlement of 100 inhabitants, just outside the Zambian capital, Lusaka, to see how life revolved around the family and community. Henry Sibaba Shafita orders his granddaughters to carry out their chores. Great-uncle Robert gives a helping hand. The family are from the Tonga people, who've inhabited this part of southern Africa for centuries.
You must be Henry.
Yeah, I'm Henry.
I'm Zainab. Nice to meet you. How would you describe rural life amongst the Tonga people?
You know, we are many Tongas around here, and Tonga is a very big tribe. You know, some are from the valley, some are from the plateau. Like me, I'm from the valley. Tongas live with kettles, and that's our real life. Plowing, growing maize, that's our main kind of life. Even sculpturing, wood carving, and basket weaving.
Henry is keen to show me the artifacts he makes and sells in the market close to his home, and I obligingly and happily buy one. Communities like Henry's formed the bedrock of African society. And as research scientist James Niaga explains, there were clear hierarchies.
So you find that first, the Africans were organized in sort of like villages. We had the family as the basic unit, and then we have the villages, and then the villages had their own form of leadership where there was the village head. The different village heads formed the leaders of the clan, and that is how the African set up in terms of governance. At this time, there was no formal education. What we used to have is the informal, which was passed on from one generation to another. You find like the children, mainly they used to get instructions from the mothers, and at times the old grandparents. They were not many engaged in economic activities. The children would sit around the grandfather, and during those times, the grandfather would pass messages of wisdom to the children.
In African communities, the role of the chief was deeply entrenched and indeed continues to this day. Zambia has even incorporated the tradition of chiefdoms in its modern democracy. I've come to the House of Chiefs here in the capital, Lusaka, to find out more about them. This is the parliament where they sit once a month. There are nearly 300 main chiefs in Zambia, including about 20 who are women. I meet one of them, 70-year-old Chief Ngabwi, who represents a chiefdom with about 35,000 subjects, around 300 kilometers from Lusaka.
The king's role, or the chief's role in Zambia, is basically to look after all the people in the kingdom, all the natural resources, and is actually the government in that particular area. So we carry out all the necessary activity that any government can undertake. Working as a community, looking after people. When we went to a community set up in rural areas, you want to identify an orphan because the villagers will look after the orphan. And a number of the orphans now who are roaming about the streets, you won't find them in the village. You won't find a widow in the village who is not being looked after. You won't find an elderly person being taken into old people's homes in the village, because we looked after everyone in the village as a community. You won't find anyone starving in the village because they used to have, in fact, a communal eating place, so that even a person who has no food in their houses, they were able to get something. And I think it's very, very important to look at the background. How did we manage to look after everyone?
It's from the language. We talked about language already. The imagery.
Victoria Chitungu is director of the National Museum in Lusaka and lectures on African culture.
The history and the music.
Sorry to interrupt your class.
Victoria tells me that although chiefs were predominantly male, that doesn't mean women didn't have any power.
First of all, most of Southern Africa was matrilineal. We had the matriarchs, the women that were the leaders of the social structure. Then you had the men that were the leaders of the political structure. Somebody would come in, this is the young girl, this is the boy, they want to get married. When they get married, the boy would move to the home of the girl or to the village of the girl. And they'll live there, and the boy will have to work for the family of the girl, because if he didn't work hard enough, they'll never release him to take the girl with him to his village. He was assessed to say he was a provider. He was hardworking. So he would work for as long as even 7 years.
Yeah. They don't exactly rush things,
No,
then, do they? But then how do you explain polygamy, where a man, especially a chief, could have up to 200 wives?
If you just explain polygamy as the only thing that defines a woman's power, it's something very complex. You cannot explain that, because some polygamy, the rules are set by the woman. Even the wife that this man is going to marry, it's the woman that decides, I think you can marry Zainab.
Wife number one, yes. Please. No, thank you. I think.
Then I would come to you and propose on behalf of my husband.
Oh, really?
Like, you know,
oh, I could be your husband's second wife?
Yeah, and I want you to be my sister.
That's
so
the
if
first
you
time I've had such an offer.
Oh.
However, I think you're enough for one man. I certainly am enough
for one
man.
We
don't
not
want to share.
Dr. Simon Rutabajuka explains the reasons behind polygamy.
Polygamy was not about morality. Polygamy was about labor needs, how societies reproduce themselves. Male heads of households controlled different family units and controlled women's labor and their children's labor.
So they needed lots of wives.
Yes.
To produce lots of food.
Yes, they did. They needed lots of wives, produce lots of food, to hunt, supplement the food with game, And this was the responsibility of older male children. So there was division of labor at family level and under the control of the head of the family.
So polygamy was rooted in the need for survival and was widely practiced across Africa. Since the beginning of time, Africans lived in relative harmony with one another and in tune with nature and their environment. History south of the Sahara was uneventful, because history that is absent of conflict often is. Africans, for the most part, led peaceful lives and cooperated with one another.
They used marriages, they used what we call blood brotherhood, and they used the friendships that they forged in the process of interacting with one another.
In terms of interaction between communities, sometimes this was of a violent nature. There were conflicts between communities competing for resources, for land sometimes.
There were conflicts, but so was cooperation. Conflicts were resolved amicably, but also through fines, through mediation, and through punishment, sanctions. We tend to look more on the side of conflict and forget that there were forms of diplomacy, there were forms of conflict resolution, even conflict prevention, which appeared to have been more common than actually conflict.
As well as settling disputes with neighbors, one of the most important roles of the chief and elders was and still is the dispensation of justice. The practice of customary law in Africa may vary in detail from region to region, but it is basically the same. A council of elders, usually male, adjudicates in disagreements. It's not easy to see traditional justice in action, but I managed to witness one particular case in a village outside the Ugandan capital, Kampala. The chairman of the Council of the Elders is adjudicating in a marital dispute between carpenter Arnold and hotel waitress Rebecca. They have 2 small children.
Saba chairman, omwami wange oyo ekyamumpaabizza mu LC bw'akomawo ekiro aba atamidde nnyo. Omwami wange oyo ampisa bubi nnyo. Ekisookera ddala anywa ekiteetaagisa. Akasente kaaleka akaakameeza katono ddala. Ate n'akomawo n'ansaba bubi emmere. Tekamala yadde okuliisa abaana be tulina. Ssebo chairman n'ekirala anywa nnyo omwenge. Bye byandeese ssebo.
Waliwo kye bakuwaayiriza?
Chairman, nange kankunyonyola ensonga zange. Okunywa. Naye omukyalo omulaba oyo Mama Aleni. Ndeka sente z'okukameeza.
Mpulira.
Sente z'okka tulina abaana abo 2. Alex ne Allen. Bw'omulekera sente agamba abaana sente bakoze eki? Balidde emmere weddewo. Okujja ekiro anangira okuva mu bwenzi. Gwolaba oyo omukyala yayawula ebisenge oyo gwolaba. Chairman tulina mukazi mwayawula ebisenge ewaka. Oyo omukyala tayawula ebisenge oyo gwolaba. Andese mu LC. Kyokka nsaba za kameeza. Chairman, nange nina ensonga zange n'abasajja baabo anangira okunywa omwenge tuteeseza ku mabbaala. Z'okunywa seewakana ekyo talimbye naye bisigadde. Nawasa omukazi kwawula bisenge Chairman.
Kaakati ssebo.
Rebecca has a female relative in tow to bolster her case.
Saakuwa ngoma nakuwa kumulabirira. Ne biwampa nabirya dda mbimalawo. Ono golodi wange. Komyawo omwana wange atasobola mulabira.
Both sides present their arguments for some time to the elders. At the end, after listening to the evidence, the chairman reaches this judgment.
Nyabo.
Wangi ssebo.
Omwami oyo mulaba?
Yes ssebo.
Ye musajja wo.
Ye chairman.
Mukulu. Kendeeza kabisi.
Ego taata.
Abo basiriva bakusigula. Si bagenda okufumba ewuwo.
Tegedde taata.
Esebo. Mama.
Era Mama Aleni nsonyiwa bambi. Nsonyiwa mukwano. Nsonyiwa.
Sebo.
omukyala ategedde ensobi ze n'omusajja nakkiriza ensobi ze era ekibadde kibatabula butawaŋŋana biki bitiibwa oli akitegedde nti ono ye mukyala we n'ono akitegedde nti oli yaani ye mwami we oli bw'aba asobezza tasamba busambi ono oli bw'aba asobezza toyawula bisenge ekyalisoose ate mmwe kye mwasembyayo kati awo ne mbasaba buli muntu awe munne kiki obufumbo bwammwe bujja kugenda mu maaso.
Thank you. And I hope that you have a very happy life and you get the outcome you want, and also you too. Thank you.
I asked Dr. Christine Mpiangu whether African traditional justice gives women a good deal.
Generally speaking, the men took the order of the day. But I think there were also some societies that had a clear understanding of women's complaints. But in general terms, the men, for example, in issues of land, the women will not inherit land. The daughters will not inherit land. It will be the mercy of a male elder or a male caretaker to say, let all the women too get access to their father's land. But up to now, if things are not lined up well in written in a will, women can still go away with a raw deal because the men still would have the center stage of issues when it comes to justice.
Is the Council of Elders always just male?
Again, it depends on the family. Again, it depends on the community because not all communities are completely happy not to have women.
So historically, the Council of Elders would be all men?
Will be all men. Yeah.
Shame.
Shame. But I think we're getting above that now.
Along with customary law, I want to observe another significant aspect of African culture, the traditional medicine practitioner. I travel west from Uganda to Congo in Central Africa and head from the capital Brazzaville to the village of Kinkala, about 60 kilometers away. I join a small group of people suffering from a variety of ailments and their relatives, who've come seeking relief from the medicine woman, Agnes Wumba.
Bunibuka kabuni sarsa nzambi kasongelani mamba mo biekele mamba tueni kwembevo mbevo yuwashiri kancha chimbevo kwacho chibere nandi mamba mo nimo mamubuka mamuwashisa gamanima tumuturiri akati tumuzungiri kukatira bushi tumushiri bikaku yo bibataka muchindombi mpini tukatukiri buna tuyuriri mumpeve kangana chisani kwatu mwana tukotele kuchikulucho tuyuriri mpeve nche chisani le mubuka bimbevo yo yabanso morai pilomo pachi pyo kuabi muisabantu mpashi beye songe pali muna chisane buna zoni nsalulu za songe la mpeve kwe mama wumba anyese chantete chakasongela ni mamba moma tutuririwa se mwana pevelo se mwana pevelo.
Il y a une médecine qui est basée sur les décoctions, hein, c'est-à-dire qu'un breuvage qu'on donne et qui permet donc de soulager et de guérir. Mais cette médecine-là est une médecine qui prend en compte les deux aspects. Il y a l'aspect somatique, c'est-à-dire lié spécifiquement au corps, et il y a l'aspect, je dirais, psychique, surnaturel. Parce que chez les Africains, une maladie, c'est toujours une corruption du corps. C'est toujours un mauvais sort qui a été jeté. Donc on commence par regarder sur le plan spirituel, est-ce que ce n'est pas un mauvais sort? Et quand ce n'est pas un mauvais sort, en ce moment-là, on s'attaque à la maladie. Bien entendu qu'on peut aujourd'hui spéculer sur la nature du diagnostic, mais le diagnostic était fait. Chaque maladie était nommée, hein, et des traitements étaient administrés. Bon, ce qu'on appelle aujourd'hui la pharmacopée africaine, basée notamment sur les plantes.
The use of herbal and traditional treatments has proved remarkably durable and coexists alongside modern medicine in many African societies. One very significant feature of African life that has also endured is that of indigenous belief and spirituality. Today, the vast majority of the continent is either Muslim or Christian. About 15% of people still adhere to traditional spirituality, but many more integrate some of these old African beliefs into their faith. I've been told that I can talk to some people who still worship as their ancestors did. I have to make my way through a forest area to reach them. They are the Kaya community of Kenya, who live about 40 kilometers outside Mombasa. A local guide, Julius Banjumambo, is helping me find them. In a clearing, I come across the group led by the elders performing their rituals. Daniel is the senior elder.
Hapa ni mahali kwetu kwa kwanza kusema na wazee waliotutangulia kabla tujaingia ndani ya msitu kwa shughuli za maombi. Kwamba tunakuja kuwaambia kuwa tuko hapa ndani kwa pengine tumeambiwa kuna magonjwa, njaa, vita, ndio tunakuja kuwaeleza hawa ndio tuende kwa kufanya shughuli za kupiga vita magonjwa. Wako watabiri ambao ndio wanazungumza na hawa wazee, ndio wale watabiri wanatuita sisi kutueleza, ndio tunakuja kwa hawa wazee kuja kufanya hizo shughuli. Kwa sababu huyo Mungu basi hakuja na mzungu. Mungu ni Mungu alikuweko kabla mzungu kuja. Kwa hiyo tunajua Mungu ni Mungu na Mungu ni yule yule mmoja. So katika hali zile ambazo wazee wangu walikuwa wakimwabudu Mungu, ni heri niendeleze kuabudu Mungu katika njia hii.
I think life in Africa itself forms a very strong foundation for the various belief systems. People lived one for another, and that understanding can be seen to translate in how they will understand issues of what they live for. For example, an individual is not defined as one without the other. Secondly, the understanding of God also forms a strong bedrock. So it's not God as understood in Christianity, but God with so many other names and attributes
What are the basic principles in indigenous belief?
You know, like in Africa, they will say the dead are not dead. They are present when important occasions are taking place, in case of trouble, in case of war. So the ancestors are critical in the sense that the people believe that they carry the history of the family, the history of the clan, and they are participating in whatever the family is going through.
There will always be a ritual performer, will there?
There has to be that person who is actually performing the ritual, and there will be an elder presiding over the ritual. So these rituals are not for nothing. They are the link. They are building the bridge between the person who is present and also the departed. And so the whole issue of being sensitive to the ancestors is very critical.
In African spiritual beliefs, veneration of the ancestors ensures the sustenance of the human race. The soul and the spirits are one. And this is something which I've seen for myself in the time I've spent with Daniel and the elders. Not all members of the Kaya community follow their indigenous beliefs, but they most certainly celebrate their culture through dance, as Africans do right across the continent. Africans south of the Sahara worshipped, treated the sick, carried out justice, and formed their communities and hierarchies according to their own customs. And this is how they lived for centuries. However, as we discover after the break, these traditions were severely tested and strained by the arrival of the Europeans.
Africans must have felt disturbed by what they were seeing, the intrusion, the destruction that was building up, and they must have felt things were no longer at ease.
The history of how Africans south of the Sahara lived before Europeans began asserting themselves in the continent has been overlooked or seen from the European perspective. In this episode, we assess the impact from the African point of view. The first Europeans to arrive in Africa were the Portuguese in the mid-1400s.
It is sort of the kind of life that the African lived. The Europeans saw that it was, they call it primitive, but actually it was not primitive because they were happy the way they were. So I wouldn't think the African thought himself less superior at that time, but with the coming of the Europeans, that many systems were introduced, they were supposed to oppress and make the African feel from the European side that he is inferior, and therefore he's supposed to till the land, he's supposed to serve in their farms, basically providing very basic services to the Europeans. But at the point of the coming of the Europeans, the African man, the African woman was very comfortable the way he lived.
One major example of the changes brought by Europeans was religion. They believed that they needed to bring Christianity to the Africans as a civilizing mission, and they went to great lengths to do so. These are the ruins of the first cathedral built in West Africa by the Portuguese, which they began to construct in the mid-1550s. Our Lady of Grace Cathedral in Ribeira Grande in Cabo Verde or Cape Verde. Stones from Portugal were transported for the construction. This is a sketch from a 19th century Dutch book of what the cathedral and surrounding buildings would have looked like. Although monotheistic religions like Christianity had been introduced to some parts of East, West, and North Africa centuries earlier, most sub-Saharan Africans still practiced their traditional beliefs in the 1500s. From the 16th century onwards, European missionaries went to Africa. Although this program is about pre-colonial life in Africa, it is easy to understand the impact of the missionaries through the activities of well-known ones like the German Thomas Kraft, who went to East Africa in the 1800s. He set up the oldest church in East and Central Africa, St. Paul's in Rabai, outside Mombasa in Kenya, where Father William is the pastor. Part of the church complex is a museum which displays exhibits used by Thomas Kraft.
This was the altar. These chairs are the one that were introduced by that time. All this, what you see, the chairs are the thing that he used, Dr. Kraft. Here, this is a chalice.
But the best-known missionary is probably Scotsman Dr. David Livingstone. By Victoria Falls, there's a statue of him, and to this day, there's a city in Zambia that bears his name.
God direct your path. Whether it's which relationship to enter, may God direct your path.
Pastor Bruce Msidi preaches at Mount Zein Christian Center in Lusaka, Zambia.
Amen. It is your portion in Jesus' mighty name.
David Livingstone, the Victorian missionary, is most associated with what is today Zambia. This is where he died. How important was he in spreading Christianity to what is Zambia today?
He was very key to what Zambia has become today. So we believe that if it was not for his work, his prayers, his investment into Zambia, that the Christianity we see today would probably not be as it is today.
And you don't understand any ambivalence that some Zambians might have about having this white missionary as such an iconic figure in your view?
I think while others may feel that way, I think in everything there's the good and in everything there's the bad. And I think if we look at the good things that came with even the missionary, even with David Livingstone, I think there's a lot of good things that came. Of course, there are some things that are arguable, that are debatable, but I think as a whole, he helped set the pace, the foundation for the Christianity that we know today. And I think the role of a Christian or even a Christian leader today is to be able to identify the things that are valuable from African traditional beliefs that can work hand in hand and that are in line with the Word of God and that we can work with.
Sister Dominic Dipio is a Roman Catholic nun who's a professor of literature in Uganda.
The missionaries are very difficult to separate from the colonialists because the race of being white already positions them in the way they thought about the African. And therefore, they looked at everything that was African as heathen and therefore needing cleansing. And perhaps they did not invest so much in understanding the logic. And I think
but heathen, but also inferior?
Absolutely. Yes, and I think what blurred them from seeing the value and the humanity of these people was the race. And therefore, the universal superior race was the West, and the African was the inferior, to bring light to, as if there was no light here.
Maybe something,
along with African belief systems, local languages were also seen as inferior by the Europeans. These were not valued by the colonialists, who instead emphasized the teaching of their own languages.
Up to now, we are feeling it because we are told we should not speak our languages. I think one presenter talked about how, he had to relearn his language because when going to school, you are told you can't speak your language. And religion can be very powerful, and everything that we were doing as our culture was destroyed to the extent of even names. And when you talk of names, you're talking of identity. And people were given Christian names.
Your
you
name
know.
is Victoria.
You can imagine.
The Queen.
Yeah. Can you imagine that? So that's
It's a very lovely name,
It's
though.
a lovely name, but you know, not the way it was given. Most people will tell you they have a name, but when they go to be baptized, the priest would demand for the Christian name.
Yes.
So this man was telling us he's Frank, but he has his name. What was the name? Taza. So that was the name.
Being baptized, there was Frank.
So it did a lot of damage, and the damage is still going on, because now we are even told, you know, your ancestors are evil, you cannot carry an ancestral name, that's why you are having problems in your life. So really, Christianity did quite some damage, and it's not finished yet. We are still struggling with it.
The issue of language is one that generates much heated debate. The acclaimed Kenyan writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o is a great advocate of maintaining African languages. He gave us this quote for the program.
If you know all the languages of the world and you don't know your mother tongue or the language of your culture, that is enslavement. But if you know your mother tongue or the language of your culture and add all the other languages of the world to it, that is empowerment.
Wa Thiong'o wrote his most famous novel, A Grain of Wheat, in English, but now writes extensively in his native Gikuyu. However, Nigerian author Wole Soyinka, who was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1986, believes the dominance of European languages could actually be good for African languages.
Now, there's no question, however, that with the entire, shall we say, economic, religious, cultural baggage that goes with a language, when it is as powerful as English has been historically, definitely the indigenous languages will, to some extent, be vitiated. By contrast, however, that very awareness results in a reinvigoration of languages. The awareness that something is happening to your language also redoubles the effort to make sure that language stays alive.
We have not invested so much in developing our local literature, but I must say today there is a lot of consciousness coming up about the importance of writing in your local language. In this university, for instance, for a long time, there were no departments that teach local languages, but it's now close to 15, 20 years we have had departments that teach local languages. And of course, Africa has so many languages, and that's yet another challenge. But other linguists say, really, if Africa cared to group its languages, they are not really as many as they appear. The whole thing is the mindset of really not having enough consciousness to think politically about the importance of developing a language, and if need be, to have a list of words that can be shared across different languages.
Sister Dominic says this is not as difficult as it may seem, since although there are many African languages, they all fall under 5 basic groups and have great similarities. Africa's history is inextricably linked with anthropology, language, culture, traditions, and beliefs. You cannot understand history if you do not understand this, and it must be seen from an African perspective.
Our point of view, how do we see ourselves, or how do we see the world? The way we see the world might not be the same way other people see the world. For instance,
Victoria is keen to ensure that this group of Zambians know about their history.
And then how do we tell our stories? How do we tell them? The way we tell our stories is different, can be different from other people being told in this music. So in our culture, we sing our stories, and from our music, we can get our stories and get to write and put it into the books that we want, and other people can read our stories and also sing with us when they are reading. So from here, we will move to the main hall so that we can see.
Victoria says that given the lack of written records for some chapters of African history, we can learn a lot from archaeology, art, oral tradition, song and dance. She invites me to watch a special performance with her students.
What we are going to see.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Let's go and listen.
We can see that.
Thank you.
Victoria tells me this song and dance is about an unproductive male who is failing to pull his weight in the community. The finger is not pointed at any one individual, but hopefully the message gets through. The dancers are all male, and in this performance, one of them dresses as a female and dances seductively to portray the beauty and attraction of women. The idea that Africa was discovered by Europeans, that little of note was recorded before their arrival, is a mistaken belief that has remarkably persisted for a long time. We have seen how they structured their own societies for millennia. This series is based on UNESCO's General History of Africa, the continent's story told by the people themselves, and this is crucial for African intellectuals and educators.
It's very important for us today to challenge our students to sometimes rethink how Africa has been framed, to challenge ourselves to go and research on primary data on Africa instead of simply relying on what has been constructed or published. Some of them are framed within certain lenses which require challenging. They're no longer at easiness. It's still very present with us because I think as Africans we are still struggling with our identity.
My students are meant to appreciate that this was African culture and it was evolving, and there were different forms of knowledge which are still useful. For instance, in the area of crop production, I tell them that if you look at our agriculture, for example, we still rely probably 70–80% of this handed down knowledge to grow our food. Africa used to feed itself, and in all kinds of protein, carbohydrate, grain, from the pre-colonial up to at least early years of colonial period, but now it imports food running into billions of dollars.
In this episode, we've seen how the Africans' traditional way of life was becoming affected by European actions. It also presages one of the ugliest chapters in world history, that of the transatlantic slave trade. In the next episode, we look at the origins of this slave trade. How, why, when, and where did it start? And the devastation it brought to Africa.